How's it going, everyone? Eulier Gonzalez here. Right now we are looking at the Vue 3 fundamentals, and yesterday we saw how can we now create our React components version 18 and compare that with the Vue, both of them using the CDNs, and see how interesting is their approach in terms of creating user interface, which is in the case of React. And at the end of the day, this is using some of this wrapper around the DOM, right? That's what we have, for example, here is the React, which is a wrapper around the DOM and expose some additional features that the DOM has. In this case, it's just as a way to compose this user interface, right? And here we got an example. So in the context of React 18, we need to import is the API surface, as well as where it's going to be rendered the render engine, in this case the React DOM. So all of this is just to actually see is that, hey, I'm going to build this element, and this will be my root entry point, right? So, however, the way how now Vue works here, which is, all right, we put this CDN tag here, and then as a way to now actually show content to that, instead of actually us having to create this user interface, we just only is creating this tracking system. That's what we are doing here with this create app. We are telling to this app method from Vue is that, hey, let's go to create our apps. In this case, let's go to now or provide me is a reactive compiler optimized rendering system. What does it mean is that behind the scenes is now allowing us to keep track our state and reflect those changes. So keep track the JavaScript state change and reflects those on the HTML, which is exactly what it's doing here, you know? So after we define this, all right, so this div ID initially is have this something, this weird thing, okay? So when we, so what we got is this. Let me actually put it here, Vue 3. All right. So by the time we actually are doing this, okay, so the browser is not rendering each one of those elements, it's transforming the HTML into a DOM or into a CSS object model here. So it actually parses this, and then when we're going to parse our DOM or the body of our DOM, it say, hey, we have these things called ID. It doesn't throw any errors, all right? It parses that quickly, and right before that, it has now this script where we are now creating the application and telling us, hey, this will be the entry point. The moment that we're going to mount our application here, this will be the entry point for our reactivity system, which is in this case, this one. And this is something very powerful and flexible, because this is something that you can use in business environments and in corporate environments, where you say, hey, I need you to add this particular feature to, sorry, I need to add this particular feature to the application, okay? And I want to do that quickly, right? So as you can imagine here, you can create as many as create application or rendering system applications that they don't communicate to each other. So you can say something like, hey, app one, all right, and then you want to create is another one that is say, hey, app one will be now mount in here, and you can say something like this, And now app 1 is going to mount is this message, which will be is the app 1, all right, and this will be now the app 2, and I want to mount is here, okay. And as you can see, it's actually mount. Interesting. Interesting. So it doesn't allow me to mount multiple applications here. That's interesting. That's interesting. That's interesting. That's interesting. Okay. That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. Right? That's very, very interesting. This is if you want to use now a build step for that, or if you just want to use from CDN. But now this is something interesting. So as you can imagine here, we are not able to, okay, unless we say something like this, view.create the app, and similar to this. Well, at the end of the day, this is the same instance. That's what happened, because this is the same instance of view. If we say, for example, hey, this is view 1, view app 1, and you say view, as a way to create now a new object.assign here from this one, okay. And this is the view app 1, and here you want to say, hey, I want you to now create is in memory is a new object here from the view, all right, and say, hey, this will be now is view 2, right? Nope, it doesn't work. It only supports one at a time. Interesting. So multiple instance, then you support multiple instance, multiple applications instance, for example. If you're using Vue to enhance server rendering HTML, you only need Vue control a specific part of a large basis. Exactly. Instead, to create multiple small application instances and mount them on the element they are responsible for. Avoid mounting a single application instance on the entire page. Instead, create multiple smaller application instances. Well, that's pretty much what we're doing here, or what we're trying to do. That's another thing. It's like, hey, I want you to mount this rendering system here in this app, and also mount is another here. Let me call this message 1. Nope, it says that doesn't work. Create app, and it doesn't mount. What about, let's gonna hold this and call it as a container. Say, hey, this will be called now container 2, right? This is interesting. Well, you're not limited to a single application instance on the same page. You create API, allow multiple Vue applications to coexist on the same page, each with its own scope for configuration and global assets. If you're using Vue to enhance server rendering HTML and only new Vue to control a specific part of a large page, avoid mounting a single the application instance of the entire page. Instead, create multiple smaller applications to mount them. But this is quite interesting. At least for the CDN, okay, CDN speaking, is this doesn't work. That's quite interesting. Yeah, that's quite interesting. Even though that the example here say, hey, you can mount this and mount it to another one, and so on and so forth. Does the order here matter? No. If I put this now the app 1, and then I say app 1, you're supposed to work. I'm telling message 1. Oh, I get it. As usual, human errors. And there you got it. Now it works, right? It's actually mounted. If you want to mount multiple reactive rendering systems, okay, we are mounting, in this case, multiple view, or aka rendering systems. Right? Exactly. For DEMA purpose. Right? So you can imagine that this is what it's doing behind the scenes as it is. So all right, so far so good. So we got this. Okay. So far so good, because this actually answer is the question that, let me actually here, because the order matter here, we mount this and this too. Wait, what? For real? You say this exactly, and there you go. So the idea here is to understand now this particular concept and what now this libraries represents. And this is the core of all of this. So once you are able to understand this and describe this, okay, so what is React? Well, is a library for building user interface. This is a wrapper around the DOM that expose, for example, create elements and other APIs, so we can focus on building user interface. And because of that, we actually end up having to call all of these JavaScript operations when it comes to build each one of those user interface. That's when we use this JSX. Okay, so far so good. But in the case of Vue, we say, hey, this is now a reactive rendering, a reactive compiler optimized rendering systems. So it means that we're gonna handle behind the scenes when a state change and reflect those change up in the DOM. Behind the scene, they must be using some technology like proxy, similar like the immutable data structure, as a way to detect when a particular object, in this case, when a particular object, like a message, actually change, and when that change, you can trigger any of these traps or any of these proxy methods that allow us to detect. These proxy methods provide you is an API to detect when one of these most common internal object methods happen. So for example, when you set a value, when you set a property value, or when you get a property value, you know, and just to mention two of them, because you also have another ones. So when that happens, you say, hey, let me now actually behind the scenes trigger and interpolate wherever I found this message and then replace that with the proper content. So in other words, this is an HTML interpolator, right? So you can think of this as it is. So Vue have this principles, which is approachable, performance, is versatile, it is community first, okay? But the value proposition of this, despite all of these benefits, that is approachable because it is using the existing web standards, and also is performant because now it is a reactive compilers based, compiler optimized. It's a reactive compiler optimized rendering system. It means that it doesn't generate things on the fly. It generates that things at build time, and then updates that. And also is community driven because, well, unlike Angular and Facebook, they actually now were backed by Google or Facebook. Okay, so far so good. This actually is now the value proposition of Vue as a way to understand now what is Vue at the end of the day, right? Is this a data? It uses this data event-driven HTML interpolator. This is a fancy way to say whenever the JavaScript state change, or whenever a property on the whenever a state in JavaScript change, it will reflect those changes on the DOM. So in other words, is that this event-driven, all right, this data event-driven HTML interpolator is all that means. It's just a fancy way to say all of that. But it's important to now understand and be able to describe that, because, and especially if you go down into this low level, because now you have a deep understanding of what it's doing and how do we get here, right? So, in other words, it will update the UI with the latest change, so you can focus on building your business, and instead of tracking and keep up to date different UI state, which is something that is quite cumbersome, especially as your application grows and grows and grows. This is one of the value proposition of Vue. And here we look at the subtle difference between one and the another. Let me actually, in fact, change this. Let me change this. Just like that, to make it much more simple. And there you got it. All right, good. This is now the view, right? Well, this is now the view for real. Okay. If I put the doc type here, are you able to pass me down there, Maxwell? Are you able to pass me is with this little color, nice color? No. Okay, no problem. Chill. Yeah, it's like chill, bro. Okay. This one. Okay. There you got it. I'm gonna leave this as it is, and in fact, I'm going to change this and say hello there. And in fact, say hey, hello there. Similar for this, hello there, and the particular title here for that, which is basic example here with React 18, and basic example here for a Vue, right? Say Vue 3. All right. So now the way of how can we actually is starting to interact with this reactivity system as a way to render element, which is one of the most things that we have to do, one of the most common things to actually do in as programmer is to how we can render elements here is by using some of this directive. Okay, some of this directive where we are quite familiar with, right? So the whole point of looking at this from the CDN is, as I mentioned before, most of the time for business operations, such as, hey, we need to actually implement these particular features, and we can try to go with Vue, implement that, make everything that work as expected, and then as the applications, or as we adding more and more features to this, because the planning and migration is something that is not feasible in terms of time constraint, and stop development is not for the sake of migration, is definitely something that is not going to happen. So we need is to actually along the way improve this kind of things, right? So all right. So it now slowly but progressively started to make a lot of sense, starting to make a lot of sense. So what are the directives that we can go with, especially as a way to render list of elements, right? Unlike any other languages, okay? So for example, it's gonna go with this as a way to now render an event and register a listen events. So let's go for our example here, and then we're gonna do that in React 18 as a way to see the subtle difference and how we need to do only to achieve the same behavior, right? So let's get into this. We're gonna create a new one, right? This new one will have now instead is it's gonna render a list of elements, right? Which it will tell you, hey, this is odd or not.
We wanted to be really excited about the fact that it's even. We can actually do to uppercase in here and run it. And then you'll see that it'll actually transform the text. It'll basically run the JavaScript inside of it immediately. So theoretically, you could also do things like, well, let's just multiply like math.random in here, and we refresh this, boom. I mean, please. We have some interesting numbers up here. But that's something to consider. Now, the thing about this is when people discover this, sometimes they get really carried away. And we're talking like ternary statements and ternary statements. And that to me is very, I would say, anti-Vue ethos in that we're trying to make it easy for people to understand the code base, right? So I would say when it comes to basically inlining your JavaScript inside of these double curly braces, I would say keep it to a minimum and try to abstract that logic as much as humanly possible. So the question we have here is in regard to the differences between the Vue 2-way and the Vue 3-way. So the Vue 3-way, as we see here, is that you can abstract a helper function from Vue, or if for those familiar with the Vue 2-way, we had Vue, it was new Vue. You would instantiate a new Vue at this way. And so part of the reason
using the function constructor,
this approach has changed is because Vue 3 has become a lot about becoming modular and performant. In other words, being able to split apart things that you don't need. With this sort of new Vue approach, basically you have everything instantiated with it, and it was a lot harder from like a bundling perspective. Like think of it from a library maintenance perspective. That was a lot of the motivation behind this new approach, which you'll see a lot more in Vue 3 code bases, is that there's a lot of helper functions, which we'll actually see in this workshop, that allow you to basically break apart pieces of Vue that are helpful in certain instances, and otherwise it'll know to either drop certain things and optimize itself away.
I expected that V4 inside the UL instead of UL added.
So the question here is around the idea of the V4 element being like basically someone having the impression that they thought that they would put it on the UL element. But the reason why this is not the case is because we have to think through what exactly we want the renderer to be looping through, right? What is the element we're repeating? And in this case, we're repeating the list in this regard, and not say like we don't want the entire unordered list. So for example, if we did this, you'll see we'll just show the difference. So we can do it like this. And if we refresh it, you'll notice that at first glance it kind of looks the same, but when we take a look underneath, you'll see that there are individual unordered lists happening in this case. So don't get me wrong, if in the case you have a bunch of, like, okay, let's just actually give that example. If in the case we have different things that were going on in each element, so let's say that, okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have like an object here, let's say like name, we do text pastry 1 to 3, and then ID, let's just do text pastry ID, whoop, and that first, text pastry ID, boom. Okay, save. Okay, So here we have a more complex data set, right? We have a bunch of objects in each. So if I refresh this now, you might notice that, well, nothing, did I mess something up?
Because you need to access to that element.
Oh, I am doing math. Okay, that totally makes sense. All right, okay, here we go. So now if I save this. So in this particular case, maybe then inside of here, we then have a sub list. So I realized I actually didn't even add the other thing I needed. So we could even say inside of here, we had another list inside of here. That was then 1, 2, 3, for example. Then we might say, for example, in this particular list, we want the first item to show the ID. So we say number.id. And then we could then embed a second list, and that's where we would loop through number.list like this. So instead of number, I'm going to say switch this to item, because now this is more accurate. And then number in number list, and then number like this. So now we refresh this. I broke something.
List.
It must be item.
List.
Number list.
Number,
Must
oh
be
yes, ha,
item.
good catch. Okay, there we go. And so that's an example where you might want to loop, possibly. Although at that point you might even be a div, and kind of be wondering why you'd want just the one. But basically consider how you want the semantic HTML to be rendered out at the end of the day, and that's the key thing. Let me quick note for the next question. In case anyone was wondering how I sort of did the data population, that is the text pastry VS Code extension. That's highly underutilized, but it's really great at generating things on the fly as far as ranges, and also like custom UUIDs, which is great for random data when you're doing some sandbox coding like I did. Next question.
Is that data attribute in the create app, is that required, or can we rename it to something like state?
So the question here is around this particular keyword data here. In this particular context, when you're passing a configuration object to create app, this is basically a reserved keyword in that it is called data and that's what it has to be. However, I will tell you right now that if you're more of a fan of calling it state, there's going to be another style of components that we'll be covering that will allow you to basically name things as you see fit. But basically what you're seeing here is basically a preview of what is known in Vue 2, or well, Vue 2 and Vue 3 as the options API, in that Vue will provide you a set of options to do what you need to do inside of your app. And those configuration and railguards are actually, in my opinion, very powerful when it comes to people either onboarding to Vue for the first time or when they're looking to set like a standard and consistency across.
Okay.
And so what we'll be doing today as far as for basically going forward for the rest of the workshop, you can find all the different snapshots of where we start and stop inside of the individual branches. And so basically, let me go ahead and add everything. So check, takes.
We're going to take us the different.
We changed the playground. So the playground was for me, so I'm going to go ahead, hit feature.
Begin.
Add,
Okay,
live
which
coding
is this one.
essentials. Let's see, reactive data.
All right.
Okay, so I'm going to push that up. Git push. I haven't done this yet. This real quick. So if you go ahead and pull down the latest changes now, you should be able to see all the stuff that I did inside of the playground. Now, of course, I saw that some people were coding along, which I was really happy to see. But of course, we're going to give you a chance to actually practice that on your own without any guidance. So, and activates it, it swaps it out. And then go ahead and drop in as much reactive data as you want. Again, play for me that I use are like from screen readers and that kind of do just for this in the parentheses. First like this, then I'll go ahead and collapse this now. I'm gonna use a multi, and that's basically it. So in this case, we have ang, we have, so they're gonna do that, we had. And so the 1s we're sort of creating, gonna mount it, mind your thinking, then show that. When you use the v-if directive, what Vue is actually doing is, if you take a look here, is that the UL that you have here for the else condition does not even exist on the DOM. So basically the elements are being destroyed and recreated each time you toggle that. So as you can see here now, if we take a look at the app, you'll notice here that the UL is present, that the p tag is gone. And so this is contrary to another directive that you will see in Vue called v-show, which is, I'll say, its less popular cousin. And that's because what v-show does is it toggles the visibility of the element via CSS. And so,
so in any case, so actually let's get into the act of creating now this particular list, okay? As a way to, well, understand what we need to build, right? No, I don't think it's this one. What? It's in, there you got it, exactly. This is exercise 2, that's right. But I just want us to take a look at the solution 2 here, which is creating now is the avatar names. No? You have not the avatar names? Okay. All right. Zero. What is the 0 1 solution here? Okay, this is when you create that, and this is the index.html. Exactly, it's this one. We just wanted to create a single list of elements in Vue, right? So the way of how we can create this single list of elements, and here we're gonna say is now a Vue rendering list or Vue 3 rendering list. Where here we're gonna say, hey, I want you to define now this as the what will be the character here, character list. Okay, so character list will be a collections of all of these objects that will have now the name of the avatar character as it is, and also is this 2 1. Okay, so you have now Suko, second have Yasuko, right? You also have now top. You also have Katara. Okay, and then as a way to render this, unlike React that you regenerate is these elements in JavaScript, and then it's on the particular elements you're gonna render inside of this. Okay, that's what we have. For example, things like here. Let me actually do this. All right, and then now show all of these elements here and say something like this. I'm just gonna put on a p tag. When you say, hey, if these elements are not present, so you say, hey, if the character list dot length is equal to 0, all right, then here we're gonna say it's like, hey, there is no character, right? No, they are, because they're multiple, there are no characters. So we close this, right? However, if we find them, right, so we can say, hey, I want you to now attach this v tag. We say else. Remember that at the end of the day, Vue is this reactive rendering system. Well, it's gonna keep track all of this state change for us. So here we say, hey, I want you to now in this order list, right, is to render all of these elements here, and I want you to do that inside of this for directive, which is something that comes from Angular, as you can see. Then you have now characters, a character for the character, yeah, from the character list. Okay, I want you to now is iterate through each one of those elements and get me is the character as it is, right? You say, hey, this is now closing tag for this, and it's inside of this as using double curly brackets, not a single one, unlike React. You say, hey, yes, we're going to get this character here, dot name. And one of the great things of this is that it allows us to render objects. So for example, unlike now React, let me see if this is true, which is Perplexity. In Vue, we can render objects. Is this thing possible with React. Yeah, but not the object unless you iterate through each one of those elements. Exactly. Unless you iterate with each one of those elements. However, React provides flexible ways to render objects through mapping. However, unlike Vue will allow you to render an object, you can render an object like that, which is one of the great things that if you think of this in terms of debugging, this is something very interesting to see what is the data that you actually getting, because now what it's doing behind the scene is interpolating that state and now reflect those changes on the HTML. That's something interesting. That's very, very interesting. That's very, very interesting. Let's gonna see how can we do that in React. Okay. Let's gonna see how can we do that in React, right? Let's gonna see how can we do that in React, right? This is now view rendering list. Let me save this. Okay. And let's go to create a new one, which is React 18 rendering list, right? So you got this particular example here. Of course, using now is the plain old, or using the CDN example. If you want to do that, right? So we can do something like this. Hey, I want you to now is render a set of elements here. Oops. I want to render a set of elements here. Okay. Where in this case I will see something like this. Because this is now creating this user interface, not a reactivity system. Here we will need is to declare here in JavaScript all of this user interface that we want to render here. So it means that one way we can achieve this is by saying, hey, I want you to now is this is hello component. I want you to now is inside of this hello component, I want here to actually render these elements. So it'll be, well, it when we see is the app component, all right, the app component, and then we say now is the list. You can say list component, all right, where this list component is actually is creating this element here. That'll be now an order list with no properties, with no props, and the content of this will be now is as you can imagine. That's right. And as you can imagine, here's when we're going to now define is all of these elements here that we're going to define for, which is React, all of these user interface. So React.create element, right? And here you say, hey, this will be now the list item without property here, and the component in it itself, or the data in it itself, right? So here we can see, hey, I want you to render is this and this another and this another and this another, which is this is the content that I want to show now is and you say this is and this is and, all right. This element is gonna show is and in this another elements I'm gonna show is now Suko. You know, you are actually on foot constructing this particular element. This another will be is stop. Okay, and this last one will be is Katara. Right, and after that you just want is to leave that as it is, right? And this is what you want to actually put in here in your list component as a way to render this element as it is. But because of course the order here matters, you need to first is define is this one, right? You say, hey, this is now the list of elements, and as you can see, we're actually showing that in the proper order. Of course, because this is on a H1 element, we can show them as it is. But yeah, actually, this is pretty basically this particular example. Holy moly, bro. Holy moly, bro. And this is just a basic example of how you can now render list of elements here. Let's gonna call this here. Yeah, let's gonna call this content here as the store as the avatar, the avatar characters, right? The avatar characters, like so, and there you got it. So what we're looking at this is now the way of how we can compose all of this user interface, which is very manual. We actually get what we want, but what the thing here is that in terms of flexibility, it is quite not that flexible as we might think, right? So you got this one, and this is what we show all these elements here, right? This is the avatar character. We can show them as it is. We say, hey, the avatar, the avatar characters, the anime, right? The character avatars, anime, and similar for this. You can say something like this. I don't think it's gonna render that. Oh, okay, it does. Good. So this is now how you can render list of elements in React. Holy moly. As well as, yeah. Exactly. Exactly. React 18 rendering list, no GSX. Okay. No GSX. Right? No nothing. And how this actually is something powerful when it comes to actually is using these things or allows to render this particular element. All right. So far so good, because this will give us now is the understanding of what's truly happening there. So in the case of React 18 without GSX, we need to actually create all of these elements for ourselves, or we can be a little bit more clever here, okay, and say, hey, I want you to now is define all of these elements here, okay, by saying, hey, this will be the name of n and Suko taught in Katara, right? And for each one of those elements, I want you to now apply is this transformation, which is create elements here, right? So, because the signature here is something that we say, hey, this will be is the value and the index. Exactly, this will be the value and the index and suko top katara, the can but this will be the value and the index. That's right. So map GS JavaScript. So mapping, no, not that kind of map. You think you're funny. From the array, by the way, but it has a particular signature, which is the element index and array, as well as the this argument, which is optional. Okay. Unlike reduce, which is something that you can do when you want to compose things. All right. You get the accumulator, current value, current index, and array. And an optional value, which is the initial value here. But again, this is all of the things that accept this callback function. 4 arguments, and most of the time accept is 3, right? So the signature change, however, in this we get is what is the signature is element index and array. Exactly, it's value, index, and array. But here we can say, hey, I want you to now create this element. Say create element here. That'll be is an order. Okay? I mean that'll be a list element without any props, and the value will be is the value for that one. In this case is the name, right? Say name. So with that, all right, we say, hey, this will be now call. We need to actually return this. Okay, one easy way to actually make things much more meaningful is by saying, hey, I want to now in just one line is apply this transformation and return it, right? So here's when we say, after you apply all of these transformations, or after you create these elements to all of these, after you create these React elements to each one of those elements of the collections, then I want you to do is something like this. Like say, hey, assign this to a character list, right? This will be our character list, and because each one of them are elements, this is what we can pass here to our create element as it is, right? And voila, you know, this actually works as expected. So there is a lot of here there is a lot of function that we need to know what we're passing and what we're working and that kind of thing, as a way to build this with no JSX. Okay, that's where we're starting to create all of your elements here. The character list, that's the way how we render elements here. As you can see, the subtle difference here is that we just only gonna pass the data to the view instance, to this rendering system that we want to keep track of. All right, where now on the React we say, hey, this is the list of elements. This is our user interface that we want to create. Both approaches are way of how you can now compose this complex user interface, and it makes a lot of sense. This is just a basic example of how you can slowly now rendering elements as it is. right? And then you got is now is this is directive. Event handling view modeling. Okay, then it started to describe is the event handler here. So here let's go to take a look now at the list, how you can render list here. Rendering list, which to me is something that is quite important. So you have now in React, how you can do that in React 18, all right, which is it's just a way, it's just a way, bro. It's just a way. It's the way how things work, bro. It's the way how things work. Versus Vue 3, right? It's just the way this thing works, because each one of them now have different particularly set of handling this kind of thing. All right. Good.
Can you have an else?
And so what we'll be doing today as far as show or hide it. So that's where vShow, vHide can be very useful. So once again, the idea here, building on what we know and trying to make it easy for us to do the right performance optimization. So that's a trade-off to consider when using VF. But again, I would say 95% of the time that is what you want to use. But the moment you start thinking, oh, I'm toggling, users are going to be toggling this a lot, and it might be expensive to destroy it, reach out for vShow.
Can you have an else if kind of a like a VF that
Exactly. So we're starting to this. Vue 3. So tips, right? For the rendering list. I don't know why this actually put it down there. Okay, tips. No, stop doing that. Okay, tips. vShow is when the user is likely to hide and show. Hide is too likely to toggle this element, because that's right. So tips. vShow is when the user is likely to toggle this element, because it will because unlike VIF, it won't remove the element from the DOM. All right, good. So event handling and view model, right?
Okay, so we've learned how to create an app, we've attached some reactive data. That was fun, hopefully pretty easy to do. And now, of course, we want to talk about how we deal with user input, right? Because that's what a lot of JavaScript's value is handling the interactivity of your website.
Exactly. So here we are now in this, right? Event handling view model. Because try to access the account method won't work. Because scoping is a big thing in Vue. It's not smart. It's not smart enough to detect variable scope. This is when the direct concept comes in. Event handling and view modeling, which is something that now, because one of the many things we need to deal as software developers, right? Software developers is to handle interactions. Okay, is to handle interactions. Here we are going to see how to do that. That will be challenging, because in the context of React is another challenge.
So the first thing we want to talk about is, let's open Playground actually in Chrome. So we have that. tab this playground. Okay.
Yeah, that
so
would be
for
a
the sake
great
of playground
challenge.
demo purposes, let's just use the standard example of the counter, right? Which is the fact that if we go inside of here, and this time I'm gonna let's do that sequentially. So I'll put a horizontal line here, line break. There we go. And then here we'll just do an H1. We'll call it counter. We have a count, and then we have a button where we want to increment count. This should look pretty familiar. 10. Okay, so if we scroll down, ooh, I don't like the fact that this is all the way at the bottom. I'm going to actually move this up to the top. So we'll do this from most recent to oldest. Okay,
Okay. From
so
most
here we have our
recent to-
counter, and your question is probably thinking, okay, how do we actually change data? Because after all, it's fun to render some reactive stuff. We want to do more with it. So inside of Vue, we have our data here, but the question is we want to actually change it. And so the option that we want to learn about next is the concept of methods. And so if we think about functions in JavaScript, right, typically we would have something as let count equals 0, and then you'd have a function called like increment, and it would say count plus plus, something along this line. When you think of methods, think of it as functions from JavaScript that are available for your app to call at any time. That's the best way to think about it.
So this is our function that you can call, but again, it's expose you because this is a reactivity system. It exposes you an API for that, which is in this case as a way to actually call this events or handle this event. You define
So
it inside
from
of the
this perspective,
methods.
we would actually want to then define a method, which is say increment count, and inside of here, this is where a question that we had earlier comes into play. So when you want to refer to something else in the app, so in this case, we want to actually refer to this count property inside of data. Vue is smart about a lot of things, but if we just currently say count plus plus, this is not going to work. And the reason for that is because if we know, when it comes to JavaScript and programming, scoping is a thing. So it doesn't know basically where to fetch count from. And so this is where the dreaded keyword of this comes into play when it comes to JavaScript. The this keyword is where Vue basically takes the context of the app and it will basically figure out where count exists. So from Vue 2, you might have noticed it from like this.data.count. This would be an explicit thing you might do. But because Vue knows that oftentimes we're referring to data or compute it, it will, unless you have some really clear name clashes, you can just use this dot whatever property you're looking for. And that goes for basically anything you're defining within this options API. And the benefit of this,
But again, this is because of the scoping. And the way how now the scoping works here in JavaScript. Okay. And this is the way of how you can have access to this object. To the reactive reference. Okay.
is that while some people find that this keyword confusing, the point of it, I think at the time when the API was being designed, is around the fact that like you shouldn't really have to think about what this even means. The point is that think of this as the app, and that way you come in and you refer to this app, and that's it. So when I was teaching other people Vue for the first time, even though they didn't have a lot of JavaScript experience, they got the convention that like as long as I call this, it refers to my app, and I'm not going to learn about scoping or anything. It just works, and that in itself is an advantage from like a learning perspective. But just know that like you don't have to use this, so that in the future if people are actively avoiding it, we can go ahead and do that once we learn about composition API. But while we're in the options API right now, this is how we actually refer to things within this configuration object.
Exactly, because we're working is now with the
So now that we have the
option
discount plus
API.
plus, what we're going to do here now is we're going to go ahead and how do we actually call the thing? And so what we're going to do is we're going to, just like before, we're going to use a Vue directive to actually call the thing.
Which is
And so we're gonna
which is
use
the
v
shorthand
-on.
click.
That is the directive that you'll want to learn for this, because similar
V
to
on.
what you know from JavaScript events, on click, on key up, this is the same idea. We're extending on that theory. And so instead of just like on click though, which you might think that's what I'm probably going to guess, Vue, because v on itself is the directive, you have the ability to pass it an argument through the colon symbol that we had earlier. The key thing here to remember though is that you don't want to actually call the function, because this is something that will be called when the event is triggered.
Okay, so when the event is triggered, this will be called.
Basically, you're passing a reference to the function inside of your app, and then when it's clicked, it will be called.
Exactly, because this is a thoroughly an HTML interpolator. So when the time is click, okay, and when the time is call, it'll be call. So when the time is render, it'll be call.
That's the reason why you don't call it. So if we save that, and let's go ahead and now refresh our page, you can see, boom, things are actually changing, and they're being tracked. So that's fairly straightforward. What about something a little bit more complicated, like what if I wanted to set the amount that the counter is being incremented by? Okay, well in this case, you're gonna say, well, let's say we have a label here, let's say increment amount, data. We have this count, and we can say we can just have increment amount be a reactive data property. And currently it's 1. And then what we want to do then is tie it into our increment count down here. Let me actually collapse this. And so rather than just incrementing it by 1, which is the plus plus, we'll do plus equals this dot.
To this dot increment.
Oops. Increment amount. Save.
Mm-hmm.
And to show that this is working, I'm going to switch this over to 10. And we're going to go ahead and refresh this. And you can see it's jumping as we expected by 10. But we want to be able to change this, right? How do we actually basically connect these two? So I'm going to go ahead and actually wrap this part in the div real quick. Oop, that's not what I want at all. We define ourselves has nothing to do with our app. How do we connect the two? The way we do that is with another view directive, because what are we doing? We're now extending upon our HTML to give it superpower to do what? To have some interactivity, to be supercharged with reactive data. So you do that via vBind, right? You're binding the value to a dynamic property. That's the way to think about it. But here though, what are we binding it to? We're not binding it to 10, that's not what we're binding by. We're binding it to increment amount. So we can refer directly to the variable that we talked about earlier. And so to show that this changed, this time I'm going to change increment amount to 8. And if I refresh, boom, there we go. We can see that they're now talking to each other. And so now we can see when we increment count, this is great, it's actually changing. But what do we know about this? We know that if we change now to 12, is it going to make a difference? No, it's not. In fact, it's going to reset itself back to 8. What's going on? Well, the reason for this is because you've told Vue, track this thing and make sure that its value is always bound to this increment amount. That's what you've told it. And so this is why even though we've changed it once and we try to like increment the count, it's setting it back because that's what Vue is doing its job that you told it to do. So what do we want to do? We want to actually update increment amount whenever someone actually types inside of the input element. So how might you do that? Well, we're going to actually listen to an event. And so what is that? We learned it is v-on, and we're going to listen to the input event. And what we're not going to do though is
so by the time we actually is now is setting the value and listen for an event to change.
And so what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, on the input event for this input element, when we get an input event, I want you to run this function, which we have not created yet, to be clear. So we'll come in here, and we'll go to the method, and we'll say change increment amount, just like that. And here's the difference though. Now that you're actually listening to an event, you actually get a default event object that's passed to you, once again, just like you would expect from standard JavaScript. So I'm going to call that event, and what we're going to do is though, we're just going to log the event to prove that this is working. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up, refresh, and if I go ahead and type in here, or anything happening, look, input event is being fired. So what do we know? Well, we know, again, we won't dive into the details of it, but event.target.value is what you're looking for. That's usually the convention for when you're playing with form elements. So to show you this works, if I delete this, you can see it's actually showing up inside of my terminal as you would expect. And so now that we're actually getting the dynamic value of the event, we can then say this dot increment amount is equal to event.target.value. Now, to show that this works, we're just going to also, I'm a big fan of like making sure things are actually working correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and inside of here, we're just going to add a quick H1 for the increment amount. So you can see here, we're rendering the increment amount here and here. And if I change this now to 18, you'll see that it is being tracked correctly. It's in here. And now we can increment the count, and then, it's not working as correctly. Anybody have a guess why?
String.
It's a string. That's right. So you might think, okay, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to come in here, I'm going to wrap this in a number, be done with it. All right, let's refresh. Let's make sure that works. Let's do 80 this time. All right, that works. But I'll do you one better. Instead of having to come in here and do it here,
you can use
this because the increment amount, it already has a target value. And
we can use this a modifier.
If we look at our input element, we are already type number. Why is that the case? Well, this is one way to fix it. Here's the thing though. If you take a look at our inputs, Sam had made the joke that I showed in the tweet earlier that most of the web is rendering a list. Well, I'd say a lot of the web is also filling out forms, right? I mean, that's what a lot of our bread and butter is too. So Vue was like, okay, this is a lot of work to do every single time you have a form element, right? Like, oh gosh, what if we could just learn from what Angular did and do two-way binding in this particular context? So instead of having to always define and change and track all this stuff, what if we had a directive called vModel
that actually is going to set the value and listen for that, event and update it
directly to the data property that we care about. Once you have this vModel, all of this, I say disappears, but vModel is syntactic sugar for basically configuring all that underneath the hood, which means that inside of our method down here, we don't need even read this as well. So I can save that. Now, if we refresh, once again, let's do 800 this time in increment, you'll see that things are changing just as you would expect with this vModel. And what's even more interesting, if you'll notice, a string anymore. Because, once again, what Vue tries to do is it looks at the developer experience and it goes, hey, I know that I'm looking at an input element. Because here's the thing, vModel works with other form elements like checkboxes, radio, select. You can do all that. But it also knows what kind of input event to listen for. Because you'll know that, like, especially with select, that one's a tricky one. I always have to look up the docs every time I work with select. Like, I have to code it from scratch. But here, it actually knows that we are type number in here. And because of that, the value is actually tracking inside of its app has automatically been converted. Now, if we did string, for example, here, or not string, text, convert, you can see, oh, it actually is smart enough to even to know what to do. But the one thing I wanted to show, because this used to be a Vue 2 thing, is that you could actually attach arguments, or basically like modifiers to
that.
your directives. So in this case, it's a vModel of number, for example. But I'll look for, there'll be other opportunities I'll get to present that. I want to cover two questions that came up. The first of which is around the strategy of actually tracking the increment. So as we can see here, what we're doing right now is using Vue to track the increment amount using this vModel directive. So down here, we can see inside this reactive data, we have it tracked here. And the question is, why do we even do this? Which is actually a good question, because theoretically, if we go ahead and comment this out, and we go up here, and we don't even attach any Vue powers to this particular input element, technically the text element knows what it's doing, right? It knows that it has this, I should have chosen a smaller number, it's fine. It knows that it has 123 inside already. Why are we using Vue to also check it? So in other words, like, especially before the sort of reactive frameworks became really a big thing, a common strategy for this was that every time we wanted to increment the count, we would basically go and check the DOM to see what the source of truth is, right? And so a completely valid approach, and one that we use for many, many years in web development. But as websites and applications have gotten more complex, the problem is that if we were to have some method, again, call it check input for value, that's being run right here. Again, this is pseudocode, just in case anyone wants to look this up. The reason this ends up becoming a problem is because there ends up being kind of like an inefficient performance bottleneck, in the sense that now every time someone's running this increment count, they're going to check the DOM, regardless of the fact that nothing has actually changed. And so that's what a lot of reactivity systems have provided for us from like a developer experience convenience, and also abstracting some of those performance concerns away, is because, again, for this particular example, the performance difference is probably negligible, to be honest. To just check an input element real quick, it's just a number, pass it back, and then run it. You can envision when you have complex data visualizations, when you have a lot of things working with each other, if you have to check the DOM every single time for every single element that has that source of truth, you're going to end up with...
That's one of the reasons why they are actually is now providing you with this nice convenient little way of two-way data binding. As a way to see is that, hey, once we set the data, we want to see that you actually do that. And once we change any events on that, we're going to get the data and then update the DOM properly. And if you can imagine that now to track of each one of those elements or every one of them, if you can imagine to track all of this source of elements, if you imagine to track each one of those source of data and each one of those elements, when any of these changes happen to all of them or some of them, you can quickly have some performance bottlenecks.
Because once again, if those things haven't changed, there's no reason to check that to begin with. So as a result of that, this is why in sort of the more modern frameworks we have the ability to cache things and have these reactivity tracking, and that's where the advantage of actually making sure that we track that reactive data makes our lives a lot easier. So great question. Okay, let's go ahead and set this part real quick. So down here, we can see inside of this reactive data, we have it tracked here. And the question is, why do we even do this? Which is actually a good question, because theoretically, if we go ahead and comment this out, and we go up here, and we don't even attach any Vue powers to this particular input element, technically the text element knows what it's doing, right? It knows that it has this, I should have chosen a smaller number, it's fine. It knows that it has 123 inside already. Why are we using Vue to also check it? So in other words, like, especially before the sort of reactive framework became really a big thing, a common strategy for this was that every time we wanted to increment the count, we would basically go and check the DOM to see what the...
Exactly. Anytime you want to increment the count, anytime you want to set the element, you go against the DOM and then you check that. And if you can imagine that you have now a lot of things happens there anytime you treat an event, and especially if you have a lot of elements that are, especially if you have a lot of this source of truth with all of these elements and changing, checking all of these different, that can become quickly a bottleneck.
And so a completely valid valid approach, and one that we use for many, many years in web development. But as websites and applications have gotten more complex, the problem is that if we were to have some method, again, call it check input for value, that's being right here. Again, this is pseudocode, just in case you want to forget something. The reason this ends up becoming a problem is because there ends up being kind of like an inefficient performance model, in the sense that now every time someone's running this increment count, they're going to check the DOM, regardless of the fact that nothing has actually changed. And so that's what a lot of reactivity system has provided for us from like a developer experience convenience, and also abstracting some of those performance concerns away, is because, again, for this particular example, the performance difference is probably negligible, to be honest. It's just check an input element real quick. If it's a number, pass it back, and then run it. What we can envision when you have complex data visualizations, when you have a lot of things working with each other,
Especially for data
if you have to check
visualization.
the DOM every single time for every single element that has that source of truth, you're going to end up with some conflict. And then it'll probably be slower because, once again, if those things haven't changed, there's no reason to even check that to begin with. So, as a result of that, this is why for the more modern frameworks, we have the ability to cache things and have this reactivity tracking, and that's where the advantage of actually making sure that you track that reactive data makes our lives a lot easier. So, great question. Okay, let's go ahead and reset this part real quick. So we don't
But this is the idea that why do we have to have this V model here? And it's because since the DOM, okay, why do we have to have this V model? This is a very interesting question. Why do we have to have this V model? Because after all, if the input works as expected, right? One of the things to actually know that we set the value is that by the time we set the value, we actually need to check at the DOM that we do that correctly. When you set the value, and you have to keep track which elements that you are setting here.
The reason this ends up becoming a problem is because there ends up being kind of like an inefficient performance model. Complex. The problem is that if we can really a big thing, a common strategy for this was that every time we wanted to increment the count, we would basically go and check the DOM to see.
Exactly. But anytime we want to update the DOM, we need to check against the DOM. So anytime you want to update a particular value, you have to check against the DOM, which is using is perhaps is get element get class get element tag name. You can use this or query selectors or query selector all, or get class name, get element by class name or get element by tag name. All right, and of course those things are very slow because you have to actually traverse the entire the tree down data structure. So anytime you want to update a value, which is a strategy that we're using before, anytime we want to update a value, you have to check that on the DOM.
What the source of truth is, right?
You need to, okay. So anytime you want to update a value, you need to check where the source of truth is, which is the DOM. And because of this, you can imagine that you have now a data visualization with how all of these different source of truth and with all of these different data. Now it becomes a bottleneck performance issue quickly. So that's why they have now these catching mechanisms for that.
Many years ago. But as websites and applications have gotten more complex, the problem is that if we were to have some method, again, call it check.
So instead of actually checking to the DOM to this source of truth, which is after all this is where the value it is, we need to check if this value is present and then update that.
Ends up becoming a problem is because there ends up being kind of like an inefficient performance model, in the sense that now every time someone's running this increment count, they're going to check the DOM, regardless of the fact that nothing is actually changed. And so that's what a lot of reactivity system has provided for us from like the developer experience convenience, and also abstracting some of those performance concerns away, is because, again, for this particular example, the performance difference is probably negligible, to be honest. It's just check an input element real quick. If it's a number, pass it back, and then run it. But we can envision when you have complex data visualizations, when you have a lot of things working with each other, if you have to check the DOM every single time for every single element that has that source of truth, you're going to end up with some conflict. And then it'll probably be slower because, once again, if those things haven't changed, there's no reason to even check that as beginning.
But that's the reason why we have now this V model, because back in the old days we actually have a strategy to actually check the source of truth of this element, which is the DOM. and then we have to check that is to actually update the value. And if you can imagine now that you have several elements, for example, in data visualization, where you need to check every all of these elements with for every source of truth, that can lead to now a performance bottlenecks. And that's why we have now model frameworks, techniques like catching.
So, as a result of that, this is why in some of the more modern frameworks we have the ability to cache things and have reactivity tracking.
Exactly. As a way to now, and as a way to cope with that, okay, and as a way to deal with that, checking always the DOM for any reference, right? Especially if you have a lot of the different DOM. So those checking operations or those search operations actually is quite expensive. So the more elements that you have to check, the more expensive it becomes. So what ends up happening is that let's going to now have some catch mechanism, some reactive mechanism to make things much more
That's where the advantage of actually
performance.
tracks that reactive data
Mhm.
makes our lives a lot.
The reactive systems here. Something that I am not quite familiar with this concept, but
So, great question.
okay. Okay.
So let's go ahead and reset this part real quick so we don't ruin the code.
Holy moly. And that explains why we have this V model. Because instead of actually now having to check for this source of truth, which is the DOM that contains all of these elements, now we have is, luckily for us, these modern techniques as a way to check that with things like catching and reactivity that makes our lives much more easy when it comes to do that and to prevent some performance bottlenecks.
Great. Okay. In addition, there was a second question here in regards to what happens when you actually want to pass an argument to the method. So in this particular case, what if, for example, in increment count, we wanted to pass it our own variables? In this case, let's say 10.
Well,
and then for whatever reason, again, we're spitballing here. In increment count, we're going to check if the argument is greater than the what's inside of that increment amount, then we'll basically use the argument instead of the reactive variable. Again, a little bit convoluted, but we're kind of learning the point. So in increment count, I mentioned before that typically when something's being run, it's by default pass an event object. So once again, to show that this works, let me just go ahead and log event real quick, and then we'll move on. Save, refresh, console. You can see the pointer event is being registered. However, if I add that 10 here, refresh, you'll see 10 is being passed. And that's because what Vue does is it goes, okay, at this point, I don't know how many arguments you're going to pass, because you could pass a bunch of different ones. And so rather than try to sort of force you to remember that the event object is there, the default event object that's being passed basically gets pushed to the end. So if we still wanted to access the event object in this regard, we would say, for example, now this is not actually new, this is not actually event, it's new amount. And then we also have the event object.
Oh, okay.
So when it comes to how Vue handles that default event, because it cannot predict where that default event needs to be brought in, you actually pass it in as this basically explicitly defined. So you can see here $event, that passes the standard JavaScript to the function. And that way, in case you have any sort of funky things going on, it's very, very clear what you're looking for. The other thing I wanted to show with this as well in Docs is that I'm not a huge fan of inline events, but I just want you to know it is possible. You can inline the event directly there.
Using inline arrow for functions. Oh, okay.
But generally speaking, I find that it's a lot cleaner to just have the method there because, again, HTML is meant to be, in my mind, to be readable for users, and then the logic and all that stuff, we should abstract that away as much as possible. Because what it does is it lowers the barrier of entry for those who might want to come and contribute, particularly like if you have designers on your team who have front-end abilities but might not be that comfortable with JavaScript. By abstracting that stuff away, it just makes the code a lot more manageable. So, $event is so just to show that inside of the code actually, so that we have consistency. Here, again, events, but it's not passed by default.
And for this case, what we need to actually do is that. Oh, okay.
Now when we implement, there we go. We have a pointer and we have all right. Question.
So what's the difference between an at click and a beyond click? At click is just an HTML5.
All right. Question.
So what's the difference between an at click and a beyond click? At click
and click.
Is that just an HTML5 attribute?
Ah, okay, good question. Question.
So what's the difference between the at click and the beyond? The at click is between the at click and the beyond click. At click is that's just an HTML5 attribute, right?
Ah, okay, good question. No, it actually segues really well. So something you'll notice here is that right now we're doing this v on and v bind. Oh, v bind is
Mhm.
gone. Okay, that's fine. We interact with L.
vbind is for attributes, and von is for
a lot,
elements.
as far as like interactivity and events. So rather than forcing you to type v on all the time, there is a shorthand. Which
And
is-
shorthand that.
And
Exactly.
so if you shortcut that, that'll basically do exactly what you expect in terms of the v on, but otherwise it's a syntactic sugar to basically say you don't have to type those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 characters anymore. Just do at, which honestly I think is a fairly intuitive shortcut when it comes to saying, yes, at click, do this thing, at key up, do this thing, etc. And so I mentioned vbind, and just for the sake of showing that one, I'll just do a data attribute called increment by, because sometimes you're rendering stuff to the server or some other app needs something here. And let's say you want to render increment amount to this p element. So if you look at this p element right here, you'll notice the URL one. It is. Oh, I didn't refresh it. Okay, you see that the attribute data increment by is there available for you, but once again we need it to be bound. And I said before that you could do vbind, and that will go ahead and change that to actually say, yes, the increment of by we're looking at is 8. But again, dynamically binding attributes, very, very common. So what can you do instead? You can just
Which is dynamically binding attributes or
another short
event listeners.
right or wrong way. There's no right or wrong way. Most people end up eventually getting used to convention. So you see that a lot in code bases. But otherwise, it's up to you on how you want to write it.
Mhm.
So we're going to go back to your index.html page that you were playing around with your characters. And this time, under each of your character, I want you to go ahead and add a favorite button to it. And when a user clicks on that favorite button, go ahead and update a separate list that tracks your favorite characters. And as a bonus, if you have some time, go ahead and actually create a form that will allow you to add more characters to whatever the preset of data already exists.
Holy
Okay,
moly.
so inside and add a star here, favorite. There you
Okay.
go. Favorite button, great.
So in each one of those elements, what we want
Let's
to
check
add
it.
is to our
Click.
uh,
You haven't written
to
the method yet. So
our
go down inside of our app here.
favorite.
So inside of data, we don't need that. So we need here, so we need methods for favorite character.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the argument actually comes into play. Because at this point, well, there's a couple things. One, we need a favorite list. So I
Mhm.
like to try
To actually
that.
keep track of that.
So favorite list. And so what we want to do is we're going to do this dot favorite list dot push. What are we pushing? We want to push the character that's actually called. And so the way we detect this is we go inside
Is
our favorite
by
character,
the time we
and we're
click
in our
here,
loop, so we can
we're
actually
gonna now
character
pass is the
to
character here.
our function. Which means
And
character.
here we say is now, hey, this character will be in the string.
Push that over. And so to show that that works, let's go ahead and add another list right here. This time we just add a h2 favorite characters. Once again, I see a typo there. I'll fix that real quick. V for character and favorite list. Then inside of here, we just add that. Okay, so as we can see here, actually nothing's showing up. So actually this is a good instance where we might actually want to do no favorite characters. So let's go to if. Works well. So if favorite characters, favorite list, length. Actually, you know what? I usually prefer the greater than 0 as my first one. So we're going to swap this down here. Swap if for ul, because that's my preferred default state. And this empty state is really a fallback. There you go. No favorite characters yet.
Exactly. So by the time you click here, you're starting to add all of this.
Now, of course, you can do deduping and all that fun stuff, but I'll leave you all to play with that. And then there you go, create form. Okay, and then let's go ahead and add the characters as well. So what we want to do next is we want to actually then add a new character. How do we do that? Well, at this point, the easiest thing for me to do.
Now what you can do is just define a set
H2.
for that.
This H2 would be put, and if we text, that's fine. And then
Oh, to define now
kind of obvious
a
in this particular talked about V model and all that stuff, and we know how to do some. We can click on the button to add it. Basically, add this dot push. What are we pushing? We're pushing the new character, not just any new character. It's this new character. So if we refresh that and do appa, you'll see that's weird. What's happening? well? Any guesses?
Every key.
Yep. Every key up is just like firing off. It's like We don't want that. We really only want to do this when you only want to do it when you hit key up enter. And so some of you are probably thinking, okay, so I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get the event. I'm going to do event at target, and then I have to figure out what the key code is. But I got you all one. Yep. So the audience already got it. So what we can do here, I mentioned before about modifiers to the API. On the key up, Vue also knows we have common things we're using all the time. And enter and escape keys, those are common. So all we can do is we do .enter on this. Refresh. Appa's fine. Hit enter. And then there you go. The reason it's blinking is because of that odd character. So actually, I think that functionality is basically done. So oh, right, I had that fully listed. That's fine. Okay, so then if I just add it twice, there you go. Now you'll see both. And so the final thing, just from like a code cleanup perspective, is probably just once we push the character, just a new character. So just prove that works. Appa, enter, that's fine. Then you can say like Azula. Appa Azula. You can see that our name input is being set. So the section we're going to be kicking off right now is on watchers and.
So okay, let's
So
get
we're
into
gonna go back
actually
to-
is. So let's get actually is to this particular code, which is on the solution to in Playground. In Playground, it is what it is. It's on the index here, right? Where here we're saying, hey, let's go to now. It adds some. Okay, this will be quite interesting. This will be quite interesting here, because now. Let me save this. Okay, because now let me go back here. And here's when we're going to say, hey, Vue 3 event handling, right? So the way how you do this in as a way to say, hey, let's going to add now It's going to add now a button here to our characters to add them to our favorite list. Okay. So one way we can think of this is to define some sort of sets for that. Either define as a favorite list, but in my case I want to define as a method for that and then show them properly. So the thing here is that I'm going to define now a bottom here, right below the character here. We'll say, hey, let's go to define now a bottom here. With the emoji, I never understand why this actually never trigger. I definitely never understand that. Any freaking way. With the emoji of favorite, right? And you got this bottom here, as it is. Yeah, we can leave as it is. Hey, this will be my favorite bottom here. Okay. Oh, because we can wrap this into a paragraph here, and then do something like this. But this shouldn't supposed to put this here. Okay, so we are now evaluating this one line after another. That's right. But as a way to actually make everything stay on the same line, I prefer to make this thing as it is, right? To show them like so. All right. And then we're going to now is render our favorite list. So here's what we define is our unique or the state that we want to track, which is our favorite list. That must be a new set. All right, which initially is empty, 0. All right. That's quite interesting because it say, hey, I cannot create now set like this. What if I say new set? Like that, right? So okay, now we are creating a set, which we're gonna get is unique values to this, which is what we want. All right. Exactly, because this is what we want at the end of the day. All right. And let's go into now, as a way to define is your event handlers. Unlike in React that you define is inside of your JSX is the functionality that you want to go with, okay, which is on your function, and then you attach that to the event handlers. Now here we're gonna do that is but with a property called methods. Where now methods here it'll be is a function, it'll be an object where we're going to register all of our method that we want to as functions. So here we're gonna say, hey, add. So we're gonna now is favorite character. Okay, so add favorite character, right? And this, because we're going to receive now that elements there, which is the name. All right. Well, what we're going to do is just as a way to access to this state in our instance, in this case, this single instance that we define in our entire HTML, which is, hey, this is the way, how do we access to this? The data, all right, but now behind the scenes view resolve this $data, so we can have access to actually is the data in itself. Anytime we actually use this, we reference is to the reactive variable. So we say, hey, if this favorite list, I want to add this name to that. And also, well, render here the list of elements that I want to. So for example, hey, if I don't have any element here in my favorite list, okay, in my favorite list, so if my favorite list dot size is equal to 0, then I want to say, hey, there are no favorite characters, right? And close that. However, if we find them, okay, let's instead let's instead, right, let's instead here now, instead of doing this, we can say this unordered list. Instead, I want you to now render is this elements here as expected, right? So here I don't have to create all of these elements like in React way, but here I need to create the HTML elements here, which is using this directive to iterate through all of these elements by saying, hey, what is the elements on the favorite list, right? Because I want to now iterate through all of these elements in this array and show them as favorite, right? So by the time that this happened, okay, I want to show is the content of the element that I'm keep tracking here. Favorite dot name as it is. So by the time I'm clicking here, we're going to add this as it is, right? So we say, hey, as a way to bind that event, we can use is the shorthand at or the V on the V on event listener, which is click. In our case, let's gonna go with the shorthand by saying, hey, is this one? And I want you to now is attach this method, which is add favorite character here. So here what it's doing is that instead of actually passing any variable, any property here, we are passing is the event as a property. But because we need to actually pass is the data here, we say, hey, I want you to now pass is the character dot name for that, right? Another way to say this is you say, hey, please is the character and the index, right? And in this case, you just only say, hey, name and the index, and this is how you can actually destructure this data as it is. No problem. It's okay. That's okay. Interesting. If I have the ability to do this. Exactly, so can you destructure that? Oh, it actually works. You can also is the structure data here, like so. Pretty much like JavaScript, the way it works. So by the time you click here, it will call that function, right, and add that to the set. So we can say, hey, this is it. I want to now show the exactly, because is we're adding is this exactly. Let's gonna add this element completely, right? We say, hey, character. Let's gonna add the character here, so we can render is this element as expected. The character dot name, and there you go, right? So by the time we add them, we can add now something to actually describe this a little bit and say, hey, favorite characters. You say, hey, then H3 here. You say now favorite characters. Okay, favorite characters makes a lot of sense. By the time you add one of them, you have now favorite characters. Let me actually break here. Break the line. Alright, and then you got is this. Favorite character is this one. And Zuko. And Top. And Katara. And the kind of thing. So this is interesting. This is very, very interesting. And how you can handle is this particularly cases, and not to mention that you want to add is, well, favorite characters. So another is to say, hey, let's go to now is here, and define here as a section here. Sorry. As it is, that's right. So this section is for the adding character. This another section is for adding. This is for adding the elements here, where you say, hey, I would like to now is add add a character. So add character, right? You can say, hey, I want to add a character here with this input. I can specify the type. That'll be is now the text. All right, and we can use a two-way data binding, which is a concept that comes from Angular. that says, hey, v model, all right, or we can go is with the old previous thing, which or with the more manual way of keep track things. So for example, like the v bind, as a way to bind is a particular property. In this case is the value. So by the time we keep track the value, okay, it's going to bind is the value to a particular property here, and this is the name. All right, say APA, for example, say APA, right, and then you can bind now this value to the name property. So it's gonna show that. However, by the time we wanna get this value, okay, so when we detect any change of this, we want to also update the value there, because as you can see, it's not updating that, right? I mean, it's updating there, but not in the model. How can we make sure that? Well, by rendering is now the name. So we can say here, but we are not rendering is on the state that we want to keep track. So one way to do that is by saying, all right, let's going to use now this directory called on to attach now an event. So to bind now an event listener. One of them is binding one of them is binding an attribute, and the other is binding events. So here I want to now bind is the input event to the name, right? So by the time we do this, it actually is updating properly. Hey, why not the on input? Oh, my bad. It's because we need to call a method that is going to update now the name. That's what happened. So that's what we say, hey, update name, okay? We're going to receive the event value here, and then say, hey, let me now bind this name to wherever you get in the target.value. And in this case, I'm effectively are binding that. You say, hey, now we are binding these things. Because this is a thing that is very tedious, manual, and that kind of thing. We can use this the model for that, right? We can say, hey, can you, no problem. Instead of that, we can use this to say, hey, model, I want you to bind this input. All right, I want you to bind the attribute value to this type input. I mean, it's the model. Sorry, I mean model here. What is model doing behind the scene is to bind the attribute value with the input for this case, for this most common recurring task. And we say name. So here we actually is being able to update that, and we can see that it's reflecting those chains here. We just only show this for demo purposes, only for demo purpose, right? Exactly, only for demo purpose. You can see we can actually update our data as expected. And by the time that we now, for example, is key enter here, we can attach now an input with the key up here by saying, hey, I also want to now listen to this particular event called key up, yeah, that's right, the key up, and when I hit enter, okay, I want you to now call a particular method, which is add new favorite. Add new favorite. Add new favorite character, right? So it means that you're gonna now pass here, define this particular method here, but you're gonna receive is the value, is the event here, and then I want you to update is now the favorite list, all right, or in this case character list. You can say, hey, add new character, okay, add new character, exactly, add character to make it much more meaningful. So add character here with the value that we're receiving here, and then push whatever we are passing here as a name with the event.target.value, right? So now we are able to see and push these elements here as expected. So we have APA, right? And we added that properly. So by the time we add APA here to favorite characters in Katana, there you got it. All of this is a very simple example here of how can we now use is the Vue 3 event handling in contrast with the React 18 as well, and some of the nuance behind the scenes. And with that, that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye-bye.